There are a few common rules that you need to know when using Telerik UI for ASP.NET Core. Let's call these fundamentals. These are high-level concepts that are shared among all the components and general library-specific workflows as well. So in this chapter, we'll talk about component naming, script and style placement, optimizations like bundling, and using only client-side assets that you need. And we'll be building on a real usage scenario while applying those concepts. Before we start using the tag helpers and the HTML helpers on the server side, we need to enable Telerik UI. And we do this in the startup of the web project. Open up the startup file and head down where we configure services. Right here, there's a method called configure services. You can see that we've already done some configuration here by adding some dependency injection resolvers. And right down here, we're going to add Kendo to the services. Services.add Kendo. This is an extension method that's provided by the Kendo DLL. This is what we've installed in the previous chapter as part of the Telerik UI ASP.NET Core NuGet package. If you don't have this enabled, Kendo UI will not work. This is the first step to getting things working. The next step is actually enabling the tag helpers and the HTML helpers. And we do this in the view imports CSHTML file. If you're coming from the ASP.NET MVC world, there was the view start file, and that was declaring the shared imports throughout your application. In ASP.NET Core, there's the view imports CSHTML file. You can see that the framework already added a tag helper for the Microsoft tag helpers. And then I've also added the tag helper for rps.web, which is this project. We have our own tag helpers right down here, and we need to make them available for use in the Razor pages. And we do that by adding this line right here. We're going to do something similar to add the Kendo tag helpers. So right here, I'm going to say add tag helper star, and then I'm going to point this to kendo.core. This will enable tag helpers, but it will not enable HTML helpers. We'll do that a little bit later. We've added the references to the server-side bits of the Telerik UI library, so now we'll be able to start using the HTML helpers and the tag helpers that come with the library in our Razor pages. In this lesson, we're going to look at the tag helpers, and in the next lesson, we'll look at the HTML helpers. In ASP.NET Core, tag helpers is the new primary method of adding server-side rendering to your views. HTML helpers are fully supported. These come from the world of ASP.NET MVC. There's also a course here on Telerik UI ASP.NET MVC, and that uses exclusively HTML helpers. Let's jump right into an example. But just a bit of warning first, this will not give us the expected result until we add the client-side libraries. So while we will have our server-side rendering working with the tag helpers, only after we add the client-side libraries will we get the full look of how a Telerik Kendo UI component will look like. All right, so for an example, we're going to use a button. Open up your documentation at this URL, and then you can scroll down to the components section, and the first link here is working with helpers. Here you'll see examples of tag and HTML helpers and what the difference is, including known issues, how to set it up. You'll get the fundamentals here of using the HTML helpers and the syntax for that, as well as an example of tag helpers and what that looks like. If we take a look at the button component, which is going to be under navigation and then button, in the overview, you'll see that we have a demo page for button HTML helper and the demo page for the button tag helper. Also in the initialization section, you'll see two tabs here, the HTML helper example and then the tag helper example. Let's back up here for a second and take a look at these demo pages. Notice we're on demos.telerik.com, and this is what the button looks like. It looks exactly the same, but if you take a look at the source code, you'll see that we're using an HTML helper here. And then inside the button section, you can find the tag helper section here, and the button will look the same, except now in the source, we're using the tag helper. Let's go back to the docs. We're going to drop in a button into our project, but we're going to use the tag helper now. And let's go over to our project. Again, make sure that add tag helper is added here, pointing to kendo.mvc. Open up the pages folder and then open up dashboard.cshtml. Right down here, we have 3 buttons that control the filtering for the dashboard information that's being displayed. Now, since we're not going to alter any server-side code, and we're only altering the view here, the Razor page, we can alter this page while the application is running and see the changes reflected right away. So the development cycle is pretty quick here. I'm going to go ahead and start the IIS Express server, and this will kick off the application, showing us the dashboard page. Here are the 3 buttons that filter the data by 3 months, 6 months, and 1 year. Notice when I click these, the URL updates with the months parameter being set to represent the filter range that I've selected. Back to the code, I'm going to replace this 1 year button with a Kendo button. And I'm going to paste in a Kendo button tag helper here, similar to the one we saw in the documentation. Notice that the Kendo button is lit up in a different color. This is the tag helper syntax. It's being recognized as a server rendered component. I'm going to save this and let's take a look at the application. In order to see the changes, you need to refresh. So here we see a button that just appeared that says click here. It looks just like all the other buttons. And if I click, nothing happens. But let's take a look at the developer tools here. I'm going to press F12 to open that up. We get an error saying Kendo is not defined. So we'll come back to that. Let's examine this element right here, which is the button. This is the Kendo button that we've added. And it gets converted to a regular button with the name attribute, the type, the text, and there's a little script tag that's added right next to the button. This is where the jQuery Kendo UI components gets initialized. We'll get into this a little bit more later. Now there's something very important about the way we create Kendo UI components on the server side. You see this name property. The name property is very important. Whether using tag helpers or HTML helpers, you must specify the name. If I don't have the name, I'm going to delete that so you can see what happens. I'm going to refresh and we get an error message. It says name cannot be blank. So in this case, the message is very helpful. So all your Kendo components must always specify a name. I'm going to delete this button right here and we can start from scratch because I want you to see how we can conjure up the IntelliSense that'll show us what Kendo components are available. So I'm going to open up the bracket here and type Kendo dash and then press Control Space. This will open up a little dialog here where we can see all the different components that are available. I'm going to select Kendo button here. I'm going to give it a name. This one I'll call button filter 12 months. And for the text inside, I'll say 1 year. Now, our previous HTML button had an onClick handler, which navigated using the proper parameters. We'll get back into that. Let's go over how we can implement the same thing using an HTML helper. ASP.NET Core supports both tag helper syntax and HTML helper syntax. We're not going to be using HTML helpers until we get to the grid chapter, but I do want you to know that both tag and HTML helpers are available and they are documented, and which one you'll use depends on your preference. Let's go back to the documentation for Telerik UI, and we've just implemented the tag helper Kendo button that looks like this. Let's look at the equivalent implementation for the HTML helper. I'm going to copy this example and let's go back to our code, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste this in right here. I'm going to save it and let's take a look at the output. Now this is not going to work. As you can see, I got build errors. And the reason for this is that in order to enable HTML helpers, we need to do something else. Go back to View Imports, and right here, this line will enable tag helpers. But in order for us to use HTML helpers, we need to do one more thing. I'm going to add a using statement here and point it to kendo.mvc.ui. And now I'm going to save this. And when I save it, you can see that our red underline goes away under Kendo. And now I'll be able to run this application. The application will start up and you'll see one more button added here. And this is a Kendo UI button, but it's now using the HTML helper. You can start off the HTML helper just by typing @HTML dot and then the Kendo extension method.
And from here, you'll have all your components available. And these are the same components using the Fluent API.
So I can add a button here. And of course, don't forget to add a name for the button. So button filter, let's go for 6 months this time. And then in order to give it the text, I provide the content property. This could be either HTML or we can just give it text. So if it's a short line, I can just use it like this. But if I want to have this on multiple lines, if it's a very long statement, then I need to put whatever is inside in parentheses. So @ open parentheses, HTML Kendo, and then close parentheses after my component is defined. I'm going to delete this right here. And let's take a look. I'll refresh the page. There's our 6 months button. So you get the idea here. We're not going to come back to HTML helpers until we get to the grid chapter. So I'm going to delete this. We're going to continue on with using tag helpers until we get to that point. Telerik UI ASP.NET Core widgets are wrappers around Kendo UI jQuery widgets. This is something I mentioned earlier in the course, but let's take a closer look at this now. As a side note, if you are interested in learning more about the way jQuery widgets are instantiated, you can take a look at the Kendo UI with jQuery course available right here in this library as well. Here on the dashboard page, we are rendering a Kendo button using a tag helper. And when that becomes rendered, I'm going to go ahead and open this up in the browser so we can take a closer look. It's this 1 year button, the last button right here. And I'm going to inspect that button. And you can see that there's a button right there. It's an HTML button, and it also has a script tag right after it. The script tag is linked to that button by the button's ID. As you can see here, jQuery is a dependency that we've placed in the layout. You must use jQuery in order to use Kendo UI widgets. And the jQuery Kendo button function is called to instantiate the jQuery widget. We currently are not referencing the Kendo UI client-side libraries, and that's why this button looks just like a plain button, and the script is not really working. But we'll get to that. For now, what I want to show you is how this script is rendered. You may or may not want the script to be rendered in line like this. Maybe you want to keep all your scripts in one place. Every Kendo UI widget is going to render a script tag after it, and this may clutter up your code the way you don't want it to be cluttered up. So you can group together all the script tags that belong to Kendo widgets in one place by using deferred. Let's take a look at that now. Back in our code, here's the Kendo button, and I can add a deferred attribute here. I'm going to set that equal to true. If I do this and then save it, let's refresh. And I'm going to inspect that element again. You can see the button there, but there is no more script tag. Well, where is the script tag now? Actually, it's not being rendered at all because we didn't tell the Razor page where we want the deferred scripts rendered. And we can do that by using a Kendo helper. So I'm going to go here to the dashboard page and go all the way down here, right where the section styles is. And I can use the HTML helper for Kendo UI and then called deferred scripts. This function will render all the scripts from the page in this spot. But right now we're in the dashboard page file, and the dashboard page is actually wrapped by the layout. So having it render in the middle of the page is not very useful either. So let's open up shared and then layout. Let's go down to the bottom here. Right over here we have a render section, scripts. This is where we really need to render our scripts because it comes after the jQuery dependency. So in order to do that, we need to wrap this in a section call. And then I'm going to move this helper inside of the scripts section. I'm going to save this and I'm going to refresh the page. Now we still get that error message, Kendo is not defined, because we didn't include the Kendo dependencies yet. But there's our button right there. It still doesn't have the script tag after it. However, if I go down to the bottom, you'll see that after our jQuery dependency, we have that same script for the Kendo button being rendered right here before the closing body tag. So just for comparison, I'm going to add another button here. This one's going to be 6 months. Let's give this the content 6 months. I'll save it. This one also is going to have deferred, and I'm going to refresh the page. So now we have 6 months and 1 year, both Kendo buttons. And if we go down to the bottom, you'll see that those scripts are now grouped in one script tag. So we have the button filter 6 months here being instantiated as a Kendo button, and button filter 12 months button being instantiated as a Kendo button. In the next lesson, let's add the Kendo UI dependencies for client side. You might have noticed so far that our buttons that we've implemented here, the Kendo buttons, don't look like Kendo buttons, and they don't act like Kendo buttons. They're just regular HTML buttons, and that's exactly the point. These buttons utilize just regular HTML buttons under the hood, but they add extra functionality when you do implement Kendo. So these buttons don't look like Kendo buttons because we don't have the Kendo client-side libraries included yet. So let's do that next. We're going to start with scripts and then we'll move on to styles next. So for now, let's go open up our code and let's take a look at the layout. This is where our scripts are included. Now, according to the Kendo documentation, your jQuery dependency and your Kendo client-side libraries need to be included in the head of the document, not before the closing body tag. So we're going to start with that. I'm going to take these scripts down here, cut them, and go up to the top. Right after the styles section, I'm going to paste that here. Now I need to include the Kendo dependencies. So that comes after the jQuery tag because jQuery is a dependency of Kendo. Let's head over to the www root folder and then lib and then Kendo and open up the JavaScript folder here. Let's take a look at this. To get all our Kendo widget working, we need this script right here, the Kendo all min.js script. So I'm going to drag this over here and just drop this in right after the jQuery script. This will give us all the widgets. Now, if you're not using all the Kendo widgets and you just have a button, for example, there is a way to include only the button, and we'll take a look at that later. This script is quite large, so you might not want to include all the Kendo library, but during development time, I'm going to include this all.min library, so we have everything available to us. Now, if you are using the scheduler component, there is a library that you need to include as well, and that's this time zones library, and that needs to come after Kendo all. We're not using the scheduler component in this course, so I'm going to remove that. But if you are going to be using the scheduler component, make sure time zones is included. Let's go back up here. There is one more script we need to include, and this is the glue between the ASP.NET server-side components and the client-side components. This library is called Kendo ASP.NET MVC and the minified version of that file. So we need to include that after the Kendo all minified file. Without this file, our widgets are not going to work. So this should be enough to get started. Let's take a quick look, and I'm going to refresh the page here, and we should no longer get an error. Our JavaScript error goes away, so that's good. But there's one more thing I want to do. Sometimes we may have our own custom scripts that we want to include on our pages, and we don't want to mix that together with our deferred scripts from Kendo UI. So I'm actually going to separate that out. I'm going to keep the Kendo UI scripts next to our Kendo libraries. Do you remember this deferred scripts helper that we added in the last lesson? Well, I'm going to take it out of the dashboard page. So I'm going to cut that. And instead, I'm going to add it right over here after our Kendo dependencies. So now we're going to have the Kendo all library rendered, then the ASP.NET MVC library helpers added, and then finally the deferred scripts for all the widgets. After that, we'll have our custom JavaScript code rendered if there is any. So this is the recommended structure for keeping your scripts here. You could also optionally place this scripts tag before the closing body tag, but I'm just going to keep it here. I'm going to refresh the page and let's take a quick look at the head of the document. You can see our Kendo scripts being rendered right here. And there's our deferred scripts being rendered after the Kendo libraries. Just one more note about this. We can now either use the deferred attributes for all our Kendo widgets, or we can just have the scripts rendered in line. Since we've placed the Kendo dependencies in the head of the document, that's going to be rendered before widgets. So it's okay to render these widgets now without the deferred flag. And for some of the ones that we'll be rendering in this course, I won't be including the deferred flag. We're almost done with client-side setup. We just need to set up the styles, and we'll do that next. We have a functional Kendo button now on our page, but it still doesn't quite look right. And that's because we didn't include the Kendo styles on our page yet. Let's go to our code, and here in the head of the layout page, I'm going to include the Kendo styles. So go to your www root folder, and then lib, and then Kendo. And here, open up the styles folder. And here you'll see a lot of different CSS files, and these are all the different themes that you can use. We'll talk more about themes later on in the course. Right now, we're just going to use one theme, and that's the default version 2 theme. This is the one that you'll see in all the demos on the documentation site. This is a CSS file, so it's going to go right here after our Bootstrap link and before our site CSS link. So I'm going to just drag this file out right here. There it is, kendo.default-v2.min.css. Let's save this and take a look. Once I do that, you can see that the Kendo buttons that I've added, these last 2 buttons, they automatically get styled using the Kendo styling. Now, any widget that we add from the library is going to automatically get appropriate styling that's going to match the documentation. You can see that when I hover over the buttons, we get a little bit of a hover effect. If I click on the buttons, Nothing happens yet, but the button gets selected. Now that we have the Kendo styling, you can also manually configure and use the classes that come with the styles. Let me give you a quick example here. Back in the dashboard page, I'm going to go up to where we have the Kendo buttons, and you can start using the classes just by specifying a class like this. So for this button, I'm going to set it to K primary, and you can see that we have the primary color for this theme applied to the 6-month button. For the default theme, the primary color is this orange color. We'll be able to change this later on in the course. We also can set which button is the selected filter, and we can do that by setting the K-state active class on the button. Up at the top of the dashboard file, I'm going to create a new variable called months, and this is coming from view data. We already have this stored as months in the view data. If we take a look at the dashboard page and there's the model for it, you can see that we store both the user ID and the months in the view data. So here we're just accessing that information. Since months is going to be an integer, we're going to need to convert this to an integer. And it could be null, so I'm actually going to convert this to a nullable integer. And now when we go back to our Kendo buttons, I can use the K-state active class, but I can also use this conditionally. So if I know that months is going to be 6, then I can set this button's K-state active class. Otherwise, I won't. So in order to do that, I'm just going to remove this K-state active for now, and I'm going to open up a code block. And this is going to be a conditional. If months equals 6, then I'll say K-state active. Otherwise, I just won't pass a class. So let's see how this behaves. I'm going to save this and let's go refresh our page. Let's close this out. You can see that the 6-month button and the 1-year button look the same. But if I navigate to 6 months, now we have 6 months in the URL, and that means 6 months is actually stored in our variable in the view. And you can see that this 6 months button gets the K-state active class applied to it. It's slightly indented. Just to verify this, I'm going to inspect the element, and you can see that this button does have the K-state active class, whereas the 1-year button does not. So we can selectively apply Kendo classes throughout our application. And what's the benefit of this? Well, later on, when we change the theme, then the button will automatically inherit all the new themes look and feel. We're going to come back to making our Kendo buttons actually work with the URL and navigation. But first, let's take a look at how we can optimize the buttons a little bit by rendering only what we need. There are a few ways we can optimize our applications that are based on Telerik UI. One of them is to download only what we need as far as the client-side scripts. Right now, in our layout CSS/HTML file, we're referencing kendo_all.min. This will give us support for the buttons that we're currently using, yes, but it'll also give us the libraries for all the Kendo widgets. And if you're using only the buttons, why download everything for all the widgets? Let's take a quick look at the effects of this. I'm going to go to the Network tab, and I'm going to reload the page. Let's see what gets loaded. Here are the Kendo dependencies. When I reload, it says from memory cache, so I'm going to need to empty cache and hard reload. Okay, so now let's take a look. We have the CSS file, which is 460 kilobytes, pretty small. We have the ASP.NET MVC file, 17 kilobytes. Oh, look at this one. Kendo all min is actually 3.2 megabytes. So when you're downloading this one, which is fine to do in development, you're going to get 3.2 megabytes worth of downloads, and that takes 2.4 seconds. So it's quite large. And if you are using only a couple of widgets here and there, you don't want to download the entire library, which is going to cost a lot. So let's see how we can optimize this. Head over to this page right here. This is part of the Kendo UI for jQuery documentation. Scripts-navigation is the scripts that are used for the navigation category of components, which are buttons, menus, and so on. There's scripts for layout, scripts for scheduling. These are the scripts listed here that are used only for those particular widgets. Let's take a look at an example. Here's the button widget, and if we're looking at just implementing the button, we only need these scripts. There's one more that's actually needed for ASP.NET projects. I'll show you that one in a second. But overall, we're going to have a lot of savings in the amounts we're downloading. Let's replace our Kendo all script with just the ones we need for the button. So I'm going to go to the code, open up your layout CSS/HTML, and I'm going to comment out this Kendo all min file. I'll make some space here, and let's go to www root lib kendo open up the JS folder. And in order to get our buttons working, there's 3 things we need here in order. The first one is the core library. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that out. Make sure that this is after jQuery, but before ASP.NET MVC. And the other one that we need is Kendo button.min. So I'm going to drag that one out as well. Now, as far as the documentation goes, since this documentation is for Kendo UI for jQuery, it only has these dependencies listed. But because we are using ASP.NET technologies with the server-side wrappers, we need 2 more libraries. One of them is already on the page, this ASP.NET MVC. The other one is this Kendo data min. And this one needs to come right before the ASP.NET MVC one. So I'm going to drag this out right here. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. Here's our application. I'm going to refresh. And our buttons still look like Kendo buttons. So that means everything's working as far as styling. And we don't have any error messages. So that means the buttons are actually working with the scripts. Now let's take a look at the sizes of the scripts we've downloaded now. Kendo core min is only 55 kilobytes. Kendo data min is 62 kilobytes. And Kendo button is tiny. It's 6.9 kilobytes. So we have a substantial amount of savings if we are only downloading what we need. So this is a great optimization you can do. And if you're using a few of these Kendo widgets on a page, buttons, maybe a drop down, then you can bundle those together and have them downloaded as one file, which will optimize your downloads even more.
If you do want to customize your download, you can go to this tool available at this URL. A link will be provided down below. Select the version that you like to use and then scroll down, and under web you can check all as well for all the UI components, or you can select individual components that you want to use. For example, if you select button, you'll just get the button download along with any other dependencies that the button depends on. An example that uses more dependencies is this file manager widget. If I select that, you'll see that a few other dependencies have been selected as well. And then you can go all the way down to click on the download button. Now, if you are using ASP.NET Core, make sure you check this box as well to get the script dependencies for the server-side wrappers.
Now, for this course, since we're doing development here, I'm going to be using the Kendo all min library. So I'm going to remove these 3, and I'm going to uncomment this Kendo all library. And we can do this just for ease of development.